Welcome to day 2 of the Warwick Economics Summit 2019. I'm Valentina Calvi, and today I have the honor to be joined by Angela Kane, former Under-Secretary General at the United Nations and former UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. Welcome to the West 2019.
Thank you, Valentina. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Your speech is centered around the debate on lethal autonomous weapons, against which you've spoken numerous times. How could the widespread usage of killer robots change the nature of warfare?
Well, it basically takes it out of the human realm, meaning that if you have an adversary to battle, and that adversary is a robot or is an algorithm or is a drone equipped with autonomous weapons, then how do you actually deal with that? You don't know where it's coming from, you don't know who attacks you, you don't know how it descends upon you. So it basically makes it a very scientific experience, I would say. I mean, a sci-fi experience, basically. And I think that's very much a concern, because you don't have an adversary you can actually see. And as dangerous as it is to fight someone on the battlefield, I think it's even more frightening if you have an adversary you don't see and you don't know where that adversary is coming from.
Sure. And do you think there are any ethical repercussions as well in the nature?
Well, definitely. I think international humanitarian law and human rights law goes back a long time. It goes back 150 years, if not longer. And there are certain principles that were agreed in international humanitarian law and human rights law. And so that is basically violated if you have a weapon that kills on its own behalf and is not directed by a person, either steering it or basically targeting it. So this is something that I find very much of concern, and that should not exist. And right now the debate is, what is an autonomous lethal weapon? Does it have a human in the loop? Does it have a human on the loop? Is it fully autonomous, meaning it acts on itself? It learns the battlefield environment. It learns how to detect a target. And that is incompatible with regard to international humanitarian law. The International Red Cross has been very strong on this. They've published papers on this. Other countries have very strongly adhered to that principle and said you cannot have a weapon that decides on itself, that learns by itself with deep learning advances in the recent years. This is very much a concern that needs to be taken seriously, and in my mind, it needs to be forestalled. These weapons should be banned as fully autonomous weapons. There has to be a human taking the decision.
Mm-hmm. So we have this scenario where potentially less troops would be mobilized in war, and citizens residing in countries in conflict might have a less acute perception of their situation. Could the decreased awareness of being at war lead to increased conflicts around the globe and less accountability for governments?
I don't know that it would be less accountability for governments. I think that's maybe what some governments are hoping. But on the other hand, what it would make easier, it would make war fighting a lot easier, because it's easier to dispatch a weapon rather than human beings. Human beings, it means planning. It means basically you have to mobilize an army. It means getting the buy-in also of the people, of maybe the parliament, of the government, to dispatch those people there. You cannot just sort of send troops all over the world without getting the agreement, as a president, without getting the agreement of the government and of the people. But if you dispatch weapons, robots, algorithms, and weapons that are equipped with such algorithms, then how do people actually know about this? How do you know? If you try to find out these days if a country is dispatching autonomous weapons, whether they are steered by humans or not, it is very, very difficult to find out. There is no transparency about this. And neither is there transparency about the people who are affected by it, i.e. who are attacked by such autonomous weapons.
So should the first step be trying to understand how the people today are affected by drones? Is that the first step?
What I find interesting is when you look at drones, under the US Obama administration, you actually had a policy against drones or on drones, which I found interesting. I think it was full of loopholes, but in any case, it was a credible attempt to actually address this issue. And when it comes to drones in general, not only in the United States, but also in Europe, you actually have some laws where you can't dispatch them, for example, near airfields. And there was recently, I think there was a big scare here in the UK, particularly, which held up all of the air traffic. And this is something that really needs to be regulated. And the idea that you're regulating it because you're putting people's lives at danger if you do release the drones, because the drones you can buy them for $100, or you can buy them for £100 or £150. So this is something very easily available, and then it's a matter of how do you equip them. But the drones themselves, even if they don't have weapons, could become a weapon if you launch them in certain environments. So that already is regulated. And if you think that governments are taking care to regulate that use of drones, I think that is even more important to regulate more nefarious uses, more lethal uses of those drones or other weapons that could be equipped with algorithms.
Absolutely, I agree. So for my next question, I want to talk about the news that the US has announced it will withdraw from the landmark 1987 agreement, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. So the US's claim is that Russia has been violating the agreement for years. Have you found this to be true, or do you think this is more of an excuse for the current administration to back out of the treaty?
Well, I don't have any first-hand knowledge about the violations, but I must say that the violations go back already to 2013, when President Obama had first mentioned that Russia was violating the treaty, and the US every year has a report that comes out on the compliance with international agreements. And ever since 2014, every year Russia has been cited in that annual report as having violated the treaty. So I have to take that as face value, that that is correct. What I find astonishing in many aspects is that the mechanism which exists to resolve those issues in the treaty between the two countries, the US and the Russian Federation, that has not been used more vigorously. And that means that this special verification commission was precisely set up, not among presidents, but among technical experts, to say, look into all of this, look into what happened, look into how it could possibly be violated, and basically prove to us that you are not violating this agreement. There have only been 2 meetings in 2016, 2017 that I'm aware of. The Russian Federation, after President Trump called for a ban and announced that he was starting to look at the INF Treaty and wanted to get out of it in October last year, the Russian Federation made very strong efforts also within the international community at the UN to basically call for dialogue, to say we need to look into this. This is not only a bilateral issue, but it should be actually multilateralized, and we're concerned about it. There was strong interventions by Foreign Minister Lavrov, also by the Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov. And what happened was there was a meeting in January, just last month, in Geneva, where these concerns were raised, where they were debated. But on the other hand, the sense that I get was that it was more of a political meeting than a technical meeting, and it did not really resolve in solving these issues. So you have a standoff situation, so where do you go? And President Trump decided that now was the time to pull the plug. He has 6 months to basically abrogate the treaty, but he has used that time to say, look, Russian Federation, you need to clean that up. If you come back into compliance, then we can continue the treaty. So he has done that. I don't know what Russia is going to do. Clearly it's like an ultimatum. But I would be very sorry to see that not more efforts are being undertaken to address this issue, to address it not only bilaterally, but also multilaterally, with the EU possibly, because these missiles were aimed primarily at the EU when the treaty was concluded. And I think there have to be more efforts made to come to an understanding. What do we actually mean by this? What is it? How can it be solved? How can it be addressed? And is there a way to safeguard the bilateral agreements that are existing between the US and the Russian Federation? There will be only one left if INF goes, and that's the New START Treaty.
And you're talking about brokering a new treaty. Who should lead the brokerage? Should it be the UN or the EU, since it's already embroiled in between the US and Russia missiles?
Well, the UN has never gotten involved in the actual negotiations about nuclear weapons. There is more of a platform in terms of urging countries to come together, taking care of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Secretariat. This is the kind of thing where the UN is very good at, to use as a platform for states to get together. But the negotiation has to be done by the states themselves. I do think there's a very strong role for the European Union. There's a very strong role for NATO. I think there's also a role for other countries, let's say for China, Asian countries. They have very strong relationships with the other nuclear powers, and it's in everyone's interest to actually address this issue instead of say how can we move forward. And yes, the INF Treaty was 32 years old. Was it outdated already? I think there's an argument to be made to move to new negotiations, but right now I don't really see a willingness to move to new negotiations. And the difficulty I also find is that there's very strong hostility right now against Russia, Why? Invasion of Crimea, what's happening in the Ukraine. So I think it would be very difficult, particularly in the United States, to get a Senate to agree to a 2/3 majority to approve a new treaty. So that's another aspect that one has to take into mind. But nevertheless, you have to start. You have to basically say, needs to be done. And whether it should be a bilateral or whether it should be a multilateral approach, I would prefer a multilateral approach to push member states, to push countries in a certain direction rather than a bilateral approach, because right now the bilateral approach, I think, is damaged because of the actions that have been taken on the INF in particular.
Yeah. And with the unraveling of such an important treaty on nuclear weapons, how concrete is the possibility of a new arms race if we are not already in the midst of it?
Well, you said it. We're already in a new arms race. Countries are very clearly spending a lot of money on upgrading nuclear weapons in particular. That already happened under President Obama. There's a 20-year program that's already outlined that's costing trillions of dollars. And that, of course, begs the question, why do we have the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has an obligation on the nuclear powers to actually reduce their armaments and to disarm? So you have already China increasing their weapons. You have now 4 additional nuclear powers in addition to the P5, and that is India, Pakistan, Israel, and the DPRK, North Korea. And there are negotiations hopefully being started now again with President Trump and Kim Jong-un, but whether that will result in actually giving up the nuclear weapon is very much a question that I have. I hope so, but it really depends on the skill of the negotiation and the willingness of North Korea to basically come back into the international community as a non-nuclear power. But I find that the arms race is there, not only nuclear, but it's very much also on the conventional. You have very sophisticated technology advancements, which were not present 30 years ago, but that's been tremendous strides. You have very sophisticated conventional weapons, and those also are not regulated by many of the agreements that we currently have.
Thank you. So moving to talk about the UN as an institution, well, the UN is widely recognized as an international peacekeeper. Just last year we've had a breakthrough in the peace talks in Yemen, and it seems like the UN has been the only real body capable of bringing countries to the negotiating table. Do you believe that the UN's power to continue to act as international peace broker may be undermined by the current wave of skepticism in multilateralism?
Well, there is a wave in skepticism in multilateralism, but it's only confined to a few countries. There's still many countries that believe in the United Nations, that support it very actively. And why do the problems, the conflicts for solution, why do they come to the United Nations? That's basically because it is known to be an honest broker. It doesn't have any interests of a country, of a region, so it basically comes to the table as an honest broker. It assembles a group of friends, countries that are willing to help solve the problems, and that's been proven time and again. You have very important peace agreements that were made and very important achievements, but no one really talks about the achievements. Everyone talks about the failures, unfortunately. You mentioned Yemen, and again, sometimes you have to wait until a process is ripe, as we call it. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it takes decades, and the parties are not willing to come to an agreement. But sometimes you have a breakthrough. For example, I give you a recent breakthrough as well, and that was the name issue in the case of Macedonia, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. When the former Republic, FYROM, as we always abbreviate it, even though I know they never liked that name, when they split from the Yugoslavia, they were stuck with this preliminary name because Greece would not agree to the use of the name Macedonia. And the UN was negotiating in this for many years. And finally it came to a solution. And why? Because the pressure was there with the European Union entry. Macedonia wanted to become a member, but of course Greece, as a member of the European Union, had the power to veto that or to forestall that unless there was an agreement reached. But when it came to the announcement of this, I think there was very scant mention of the role that the UN played. And I was very closely involved in it because we had a special representative and I basically was his counterpoint. So, we were very actively involved. But that is one of the things, it's like one of the issues that gets done and that does not really get credited in many ways to the United Nations. But there have been more more issues that have been very successful. I give you another one. In about 10, 12 years ago, the government of Guatemala came to the UN and said that they wanted the United Nations to take over the judiciary process. Mm-hmm. That's huge. That's basically a process that is very much a national process. And so the question was, could the UN handle this? And it wasn't an effort that was supported within the regular budget or peacekeeping budget. So we basically did it with the help, financial also, from a number of member states. And it was very successful because it actually came and showed there was a lot of corruption in the government, in the judicial process. And now when the negotiations, or rather when the processes have come very close to the current government, which of course since that time it was established, has changed, basically said, we want the UN out, persona non grata, so they're pushing us out of the country.
Yes, President Morales, right?
That's right. And then you question yourself and you say, why is this not reported? It was a fantastic success, and it would have continued to be a success, except now the UN can only be in a process if the government agrees. Mm-hmm. And if the government says, no, we don't want you here anymore, that's unfortunately the truth. But again, to my great regret, it does not get properly reported.
Thank you very much for a very insightful interview. It was an honor.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you.